Well,
I said license.
Well, two little stories before we go back to our ghost stories. First story is in colonial times, remember we were talking about how to be prim and proper, not showing ankles. Well, another thing is, and you all heard the term when people say mind your own beeswax, right? Yeah. Well, what happens is ladies back in colonial times use wax, beeswax, to put on their face. That's their makeup. And so you'll see colonial women are constantly fanning themselves, especially in the South. That's to keep the wax cool so it doesn't melt. And say two ladies hit each other, bump into each other in the street, and they're talking, and one lady starts looking at the other lady's face a little bit too intently, then one lady will say to her, mind your own beeswax, meaning mind your own wax on your face, stop looking at my wax on my face. Yep. Now, that fan actually becomes a communication device, because of course colonial men and women who are dating cannot talk about such things as what they want to do on a date. So if the lady on a date wants a kiss from her gentleman, at the end of the day, she takes her fan and holds it under her chin. If she doesn't want a kiss or it's too soon, the lady will hold the fan over her mouth. If at the end of the date she wants her gentleman to ask her out again, she holds the fan over one eye. You see, I want to see you again. And if she doesn't want the gentleman to ask her out again, she holds the fan over both eyes. I don't want to see you again. So don't you all think it would be a lot less complicated if we all went back to the fan, you know, instead of texting and everything else. And the other fun story I'm going to tell you before we get back to our ghost stories is, we were just talking about haunted B&Bs and haunted houses. And there's a B&B in Arkansas that every woman should know about, and every man wishes there wasn't such a place. Now, what the story is about this B&B is that a husband and a wife go to this hotel, and the husband was a cheater, and she ended up finding out about his affair. She confronted him, and they had a fight, and he ended up killing her. And so she haunts this specific room, and this room, if the woman and a man go into the room, whether it's boyfriend, girlfriend, or husband, wife, it doesn't matter, and if you have a good guy, the ghost will tell you you have a good guy, and if you have a bad guy, the female ghost will tell you you have a bad guy. And the way she does this is, if you're a good guy, she'll fold your shirt nice late at the end of the bed, or she'll do something very nice to the man's things. If you're a bad guy or you're lying about something, she'll let the woman know. And the stories I've read about this place, people will wake up in the morning and the man's keys and wallet will be thrown all over the floor, or his clothes are all disheveled, or there's some kind of something in the bathroom, like his stuff is all over the floor in the sink and her stuff is perfect. And that's how the female ghost is letting the lady know. So don't worry, gentlemen, I won't say what the name of the B&B is, so that your women will never be able to pay for that. So now back to our ghost stories. This big building at the corner that we just walked by used to be a pickle factory, and in 1916 this pickle factory was owned by two brothers. And the two brothers are named Henry and Herbert. Now Henry and Herbert make all kinds of pickles in this factory. They make wholes and halves and chips and wedges and baby sweet gherkins and pickle relish fine grind. And so one day their mother comes to them and tells them that, you know, you all should get married and, you know, settle down, have a family, and, you know, stop being single. And unfortunately what happens to a lot of brothers or a lot of sisters, they fall for the same person. And so these two start dating this local girl here in town named Emma. And Emma would date Henry for a while, and then she would break up with him and date Herbert, and then she'd break up with Herbert and date Henry, and then she's back to Herbert. And you can imagine, you know, no one would like to compete with your brother or sister for the love of somebody, and they don't like it either. So they tell her, they give her the ultimatum. And so in the morning she comes down, goes to their house, and she says, okay, well, I made my decision. I chose Henry. And of course Henry's happy, right? He got the girl. Well, Herbert's not too happy. In fact, the newspaper accounts talk about Herbert used to be this very sweet, nice man. Now he walks down the street and he kicks puppies and he pushes old people over. And he goes to the factory and he screws up orders and he's messing up supplies. Well, Henry and her end up getting married and they move into a beautiful house and things are great. And late one night, Henry's working, he's all by himself at the factory, he's sitting at his desk, he's writing in his ledger. And Herbert sneaks to the factory. He knows Herbert's by himself. He sneaks up behind Henry and takes a hammer out and he starts hitting his brother over the head with the hammer. And of course, he's not using the round part, he's using the claw part, so you know he means serious business. Well, he did the dirty deed and he did it dirt cheap. That's no AC/DC fans in there. Okay. You know, the problem in Alexandria is when you kill somebody, there's never an empty hole around or an empty well around when you need one. So I wonder what you could do with a body here in Alexandria.
Pickle barrel.
That's a great idea. And guess what? Herbert had that idea too. So he ends up taking a saw and he sawed his brother into pieces, puts it through the relish machine, and he makes relish out of it.
Oh my god.
And after he cleans up that night and he goes home, and Emma of course comes over and wonders what happened to her husband, he had the perfect story to tell her. He says, well, I'm sorry to tell you this, but he left you for another woman. And of course she believes him because men leave women for other women. And so for a year goes by and she's depressed and upset and sad. Of course he's there to make her feel better, but her brother-in-law. Well, finally Herbert and her end up getting married. And so to celebrate their good fortune, she throws a party. And of course she wants to make a pickle tray, huge pickle table, because that's where they made their fortune. So she tells him to bring some jars home from the factory. So he brings jars home from the factory. Of course he got them from the warehouse. They had some dust on them, but you know, she cleaned them up. And she says to him, you know, you really should check those pickles to make sure that the pickles are still fresh. We're going to serve them to our guests. And so he goes to the first jar and he opens it up, and it's the relish jar. And he takes a big spoon and he digs down in there and he comes up with a big heaping spoonful of the relish, puts it in his mouth, and then he starts eating it, and he's with his mouth full, he says, oh, it tastes fine. And then all of a sudden he grabs his throat and he starts choking and gagging and coughing, and she doesn't know what's the matter with him or how to help him, so she just hits him on his back. She's crying, trying to help him. He falls down to his knees. He's tearing at his shirt trying to get air. His face is turning blue. Finally his eyes roll back in his head and he falls on his back, and just before he dies he has the death rattle. And the rattle is something that all human bodies have at death. It's the last bit of air left in our lungs is forced out by the diaphragm. And people say it sounds like a gurgling or a coughing, choking sound. And so he has the death rattle. Something goes flying out of his mouth and lands on the floor. She goes over to it, and she picks it up, and she wipes it off, and she reads it. It says, to Henry, love always, Emma. Of course, he forgot to take Henry's wedding ring off of his finger before he put it through the relish machine. And of course, the ring didn't grind up. It just went through and got deposited into the jar. Well, she knows that Herbert has killed Henry, and she also knows now that Henry has come back from the grave to get revenge on his brother. Some people in town actually said that Henry fingered his killer. Of course, you all now know what the red stuff is in pickle relish the next time you all have a pickle. The ending of that story actually is Emma actually takes the kids and moves out of town and sells the factory in her house to get away from the news media. And actually last year I did a tour for a very elderly lady who ended up telling me that she was related to the Emma of the story. That Emma had moved to Winchester, Virginia, and that as a little girl she remembered hearing stories of this famous factory that the family had owned in Alexandria, but no one would ever really talk about it. So kind of neat to actually do a story for somebody actually related to somebody in the story. So, okay, you all ready for the graveyard?